I'm talking today about the Medevac law. The Medevac law enables doctors to be the one to determine if a patient needs urgent medical care that's not available on Manus Island or Nauru. And it provides a clear time frame for this to happen. And that's all it does. Now, this is something that Australian doctors are used to doing every single day. If a person has chest pain, a doctor is the one who decides if that person needs further investigations or an ECG, or if they need to see a specialist cardiologist, or indeed if they need to be taken by ambulance to the nearest hospital. Now, in none of these scenarios do we ever need to take it via the federal government. Now, the Medevac law does not enable doctors to have any input whatsoever into visa categories, or to challenge refugee determinations, or to make any other immigration recommendation whatsoever. Doctors have absolutely no interest in immigration law. We just do not like seeing disability and death at our hands. And that's the thing with the Medevac law, because prior to its installation, we actually saw 12 people die in the offshore centres in 6 years. Since its introduction, no one has died. Now, surely that's a good thing. They say that before Medevac, the system was operating just fine. Well, we know that it wasn't, because of the 500 cases that Doctors for Refugees has had referred to us, the overwhelming majority involves unacceptable delay in getting the appropriate medical treatment. And I'm just going to run through a couple of the examples. A man was in a motor vehicle accident and waited 3 weeks in agonising pain to have an abdominal CT scan. And when he finally had this done, it confirmed a multi-organ rupture. He was immediately flown to Royal North Shore Hospital and had massive prolonged abdominal surgery which removed part of his bowel as well as other organs, and spent several weeks recovering. Now, anyone who knows anything about ruptured bowels is aware that he could well have become another fatality. A woman has had daily bleeding for 2 years after a gang rape in Nauru. Another man had a depressed skull fracture from a machete attack and also waited a dangerously long time before an X-ray was finally agreed to. One man lost his eye because there was a prolonged delay after he was attacked in the attacks in February on Manus Island and PNG. Now, the surgeons recommended an immediate evacuation, but the Australian government refused. The surgeons wanted him to be evacuated immediately while there was still a chance that they could save and reattach his eye. But instead, they had to put a table tennis ball in the empty eye socket. More recently, we've been advocating for a 2-year-old girl who was comatose after encephalitis, which is an infection in the brain. And the doctors on Nauru recommended that she get transferred to ICU in Australia, but instead, Border Force opted to send her to Papua New Guinea from Nauru, which unsurprisingly was completely ill-equipped to treat this young girl. And eventually she was brought here, but the extra expense involved was $120,000 just for the flight to take her to Papua New Guinea instead of to Australia. Also, people have waited several years, sometimes 4 or 5 years, for treatment that have been recommended by the specialists there. Now, we know of at least 2 cases where 3 separate cardiologists have made a recommendation, and yet each time the government has deferred and flown in somebody else. Because that's the thing with the offshore medical advice. If the government doesn't like the advice it's given, they'll just fly in more specialists from around the world. One guy was seen by a cardiologist from Fiji, and then from Australia, and then finally they flew someone in from India, all of whom gave exactly the same advice. And then, of course, there were the deaths. There's been at least 12 deaths that we know of in the offshore centres, and it was in this city, not far from here last year, that the Queensland coroner determined that Hamid Karzai's agonising death in 2014 was entirely avoidable if the doctor's urgent and increasingly desperate recommendations had not been overridden. Now, there was no delay on the part of the doctors, but only on the part of the Immigration Department, who overruled even his transfer from Manus Island to the Port Moresby on Papua New Guinean mainland. Now, I sat every single day in the 4-week hearing and heard the voice recordings and the transcripts of all the doctors desperately pleading to move this critically ill man. And each time they were ignored or they were overridden, until finally 24-year-old Hamid was brain dead when he was transferred to Brisbane Hospital. Now, the Queensland coroner, Terry Ryan, found that in the case of Hamid, it was solely the department overriding doctors' advice that led to his tragic death. And he made a series of recommendations to prevent further deaths happening. And one of these is essentially the Medevac bill. So here now, doctors should be the ones to decide when a patient needs evacuation free from bureaucratic interference. Now remember, these doctors who assess the patient on site are actually those who are contracted by the Immigration Department itself. So they go through the most incredibly rigorous scrutiny to weed out those that the governments feel may have potentially conflicting ideology. And once they are there, as we've seen, the government is very quick to fire those if they don't conform to government policy. And yet, almost every single successful transfer that we have seen to Australia has required a court hearing where the government has either lost or settled at the last minute on each one. So why have these expensive coronial inquests and court cases if nothing changes? Is the government suggesting that the Queensland coroner is a naive lefty? Are the AMA, that bastion of medical establishment and authority, or the 11 peak medical bodies and colleges, the church groups, the maritime workers, are we all somehow politically motivated? Or can it be that we can just see the slippery slope when you deny people urgent medical care purely for political gain? This is a horrifically dark chapter in Australia's political discourse. Nowhere else in the world would they accept denying urgent medical care to traumatised individuals. The world collectively cries when we see villages on fire and children dying and fathers with their limbs hacked off and their wives and daughters raped and mutilated beyond recognition. Some of these wars Australia's had a hand in and others not. But unlike other countries, instead of caring for them, making them feel safe, secure, we've locked them up on remote Pacific islands. Now that's appalling enough. They're packed into overcrowded and mouldy tents, susceptible to a whole host of tropical infections which can kill them, and are in often a hostile local culture where they are beaten, stabbed, attacked with machetes and raped. And as a side note, no one has been prosecuted for the vast majority of these crimes. So the remaining people who are not so assaulted and attacked live in constant fear that the same thing can happen to them with impunity. And yet, this is still not enough to satisfy the bloodlust of this government, because that is exactly what it has become, a blood sport. How cruel, how degrading, how traumatic can we make life for these miserable people? I know, we can deny them medical care because that's really the only thing left. Actually denying them health care. Even prisoners of war get a better deal, and certainly our own domestic prisoners. Now, there's no dissent about the standard of care. No one, not even the government, is arguing that doctors do not provide the best level of care. Health professionals are the only ones who are trained to take a proper history from the patient, conduct the relevant examination, and then refer if necessary. If your father had a heart attack or your child had meningitis, who do you want looking at the ECG or the blood results? An Australian trained doctor or Peter Dutton? No, the government is actually saying that they don't deserve appropriate care, which is really what this whole discussion hinges on. They deserve to be kept in these horrendous conditions and hope and pray that good luck doesn't see them have the same fate as Hamid and the other 11 who tragically lost their lives. Why do they deserve this? Well, none of the previous reasons have worked so far, so the latest one is that they are laughing at Australia. They're taking us for mugs. Because no one likes being laughed at, so this very primal fear is the latest to be used and exploited. Listening to Dutton and Morrison and others is reminiscent of a sporting coach firing up their side or an army sergeant preparing for battle against the enemy. Only these are highly traumatised individuals fleeing persecution. And we all know this because we've seen these images on TV every night. And seriously, how can an intelligent country, how can intelligent people in the community believe that an accountant, a doctor, an engineer, a nurse from the other side of the world has just suddenly decided to throw in their career, take their family and their life savings and put them at the mercy of a long and arduous journey just to laugh at Australia? Can we hear ourselves? Are we really that far removed from the rest of the world that we have no concept of what is going on? And we just want to protect our own little patch of playground because the teacher says it's okay to beat up on the weaker kids. If you disagree that this is a blood sport for the government, keep in mind that there are currently less than 600 individuals that this bill is referring to. 600. This is an absolutely minuscule amount by both world standards and also as a percentage of Australia's already very tiny population. Yet denying this 600 individuals proper medical care has received an astonishing disproportionate amount of airtime, funds and political energy. So I'm just going to finish with a story. I just came back from the US where I visited many of those that have been resettled from Manus Island and Nauru. And one of the most shocking stories I heard was that of a young girl who'd been resettled with her family in a US town and was recovering slowly. And all of a sudden one day she starts crying uncontrollably. And as it turns out, at the table next to her was an Australian backpacker, and the sound of his accent triggered the memories of Nauru. This is the country we've become. We cannot allow it to get even worse, if that were possible, by denying individuals life-saving healthcare. Thank you.